I mean, that sort of seems to tie neatly into banking, which is also a huge legacy system. And as you're working on Adyen as a payment provider, would you see the similarities between that? Or, I mean, is Adyen very new?
We're not that new, actually. I think we're about 10 years old now. So we're a publicly listed company. So I think we went public a couple of years ago. Adyen is maybe similar in the sense that we're also a middleman. So we're a business that we handle payments for lots of different companies. When I say we do payments for some of these big brands, we don't necessarily even render the UI in the browser. We might even just be doing it through an API.
Yeah.
So like actually the movement of money is really messy, particularly when you're dealing with different currencies, different local payment methods. So if you look at, for example, the way banks are set up, if you need to do what's called acquiring, so actually taking the money, that can be really difficult and also expensive to do as a business because you need to have relationships with all these different banks. So being a middleman in that sense helps when you can kind of connect these different companies to the money and allow it to flow.
Yeah.
I think that's where, the banks, I think, haven't really done a good job of that. So that's where a lot of these payment processors like Adyen and Stripe have come in and really filled that niche in the market where it's just been really hard to get money from point A to point B. So there's a lot to be done in that space.
I find that these payment companies remind me a bit like the difference between, say, Uber and the huge taxi companies that used to just service businesses. That Uber came out of nowhere and a lot of these companies went bust because they made it really hard to create the great service design and UX experience, where these companies like Adyen that you work for, just make it so easy. It's like, because it's solving a really complicated problem. And companies like, I suppose, Wise and Spotify, they just want money to go through them. I mean, they don't want to have to have a whole department dealing with that. So as a designer, where you're dealing with things where it's almost like on the API level, working with that must be quite interesting, because a lot of it is not UI, it's a UX that's engineered by the developers. So where do you feel you fit in that as a designer?
I think I'm still trying to figure that out myself. But it's been an interesting topic. So I work on documentation, which is also designing the content management system that powers the docs. So they're all generated by like Markdown and YAML files. But then it's also, I think it's a UX problem like anything you might work on. If you go and it's like developers are users, they're people like anyone else. And I think Stripe's done an amazing job of like really being the gold standard in developer experience. We see that it's if you look at their site, it's for developers, but it's more, almost looks more like a consumer site, right? With their documentation. That's sort of what I'm also aspiring to do with Docs at Adyen, is really just treat developers like any user you might have. So they do like beautiful UI UX. Usability is really important, and they fall into pain points much like anyone does. So that could be reading the documentation, but also looking at the API reference. Then they could also just be like just considering talking to some of the developer advocates who go and build example integrations, or just sort of find ways to remove some of these pain points that developers fall into when they're trying to integrate with our platform. So I think it's an interesting space. I don't think it's been explored as much in the past, like thinking of developers as as an audience and bringing more like consumer grade UX to that space.
Yeah.
I think it's just kind of been, developers don't always think about like how do they namespace their variables and how are the APIs designed and how is that perceived by someone externally, right? So there's very niche problems that maybe haven't been thought of so much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Design Huddle. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not express the views or opinions of our employer.